In the spring of 1971, the small town of New Oxford, Pennsylvania, bustled with the kind of quiet normalcy found only in places where everyone still waved at passing cars, and most neighbors hadn't known each other since childhood. Life moved slowly there, with streets lined by brick homes, corner diners with faded awnings, and woods that stretched for miles beyond the last paved road. Ellen Prager, 21, was not the kind of person most people worried about. Independent, soft-spoken, and dependable, she worked part-time at a stationery shop and spent her evenings writing letters by hand, pages filled with thoughts she rarely spoke out loud. She had shoulder-length brown hair and a thoughtful expression that made her seem older than her years. On the evening of April 12th, after a tense conversation with her parents about her future and her reluctance to return to college, Ellen left the house carrying her handbag and a folded piece of stationery tucked inside. She told her younger sister, Rachel, that she was going to take a walk and drop off a letter. She didn't say to whom. The sun was still above the trees when Ellen stepped off the porch and walked down Jefferson Street toward the edge of town, passing a row of parked bicycles and a shuttered barber shop. No one knew it would be the last time she was seen. By morning, when Ellen had returned, concern turned quickly to alarm. Her parents contacted the police. Rachel explained the letter and said Ellen had seemed distracted, maybe even nervous. Officers canvassed the neighborhood, asking who she might have gone to see. Eventually, attention turned to a young man named Daniel Harper, a former classmate of Ellen's from high school, now working at a car repair garage on the other side of town. When questioned, Daniel said he hadn't seen Ellen in years and was unaware she had written him. He seemed genuinely surprised. Searches began that same afternoon. Volunteers combed the wooded trails that bordered the town. The Pragers explained that Ellen had always liked walking there, especially the Deer Path Trail, which wound through tall trees and led to a rocky overlook above a shallow stream. But the trails revealed nothing. No clothing, no shoe prints, no signs of struggle. Ellen had not taken a car. She did not own a phone. She left no note behind. Only a vague statement about delivering a letter. That letter, whatever it contained, was never found. For weeks, the town held its breath. Flyers went up in windows and post offices. Local news stations picked up the story. People wondered aloud if she had run away, or if something worse had happened along the trail. Rumors swirled. Some thought Ellen had planned to disappear. Others believed she'd met with foul play. Then silence. By summer, the leaves dried up. The forest had swallowed whatever trace she left behind. The Prager family kept searching for years, placing new flyers, calling in sightings, chasing any name that surfaced, but no answers ever came. In 1980, the case was reclassified as inactive. By the time the early 2000s arrived, only a few remember the young woman who vanished with a letter no one ever read. And then, more than 5 decades later, something resurfaced. In the spring of 2022, a maintenance team was trimming aging trees along the outer edge of Miller's Reserve, a state-protected woodland just outside New Oxford. Among them was a seasoned forestry worker named Paul Dillinger. He had worked with trees for over 30 years and knew the signs of rot and hollow growth like second nature. That morning, Paul approached a wide, towering oak, one of the oldest in preserve. Its bark was split near the base, revealing a narrow opening where the tree had once been damaged and grown around itself. It was standard practice to check inside such cavities for pests or animals before pruning, but what Paul found made him stop cold. Inside the hollow core of the tree, nestled several feet down, was an object. At first, he thought it might be trash, someone's discarded camping item or an animal nest. But as he reached in with a gloved hand, his fingers brushed against worn leather. He pulled out a small vintage handbag. It was coated in dust and dried leaves, but remarkably well preserved. Inside were several objects: a tube of lipstick, a monogrammed handkerchief, a small cloth-bound diary, and, folded neatly in a waxed envelope, a letter. On the front of the letter was a name written in careful cursive: Daniel. Paul turned everything over to the authorities. When Detective Nora Ellis opened the evidence bag 2 days later at the local station, she recognized the name immediately. She had grown up in New Oxford. Her older sister had known Ellen Prager. And there it was, Ellen's name written in the diary, pages upon pages of her writing, pressed flat and silent after more than 50 years. The case was reopened. The discovery made headlines across Pennsylvania. Reporters interviewed Paul Dillinger, who described the tree as a natural time capsule. Botanists confirmed that the oak had likely grown around the hollow, sealing the contents inside sometime in the 1970s. The positioning of the bag suggested it had been carefully placed, not dropped or tossed. The contents were cataloged and preserved. The letter addressed to Daniel was still legible, written in blue ink, folded into 3 neat sections. What it said would reshape everything people thought they knew about Ellen Prager's disappearance. But even before the letter was read, one thing had become clear. Ellen had not planned to run away. She had been on her way to say something, to someone she hadn't spoken to in a long time. And for reasons no one yet understood, she never made it home. Detective Nora Ellis sat alone in the evidence room late that evening. The envelope lay gently before her under soft archival lighting. The name Daniel was written in smooth, careful cursive across the front, slightly smudged but still readable. She'd handled countless letters over the years, but this one carried a weight that settled deep in her chest. She opened the flap delicately, unfolding the tri-folded paper inside. The ink had faded slightly, but the words remained intact. Ellen's handwriting neat, every line carefully aligned. The letter began, "Dear Daniel, I don't know if you'll welcome this or if it will make you uncomfortable. Maybe I should have kept it to myself, but I've carried these words with me for too long." Ellen went on to describe a friendship that had meant more to her than she ever let on, a closeness they shared in their last year of high school, long walks after class, moments where she felt something more, but never found the courage to say it aloud. She wrote, "There were things I never said because I was afraid you didn't feel the same. And maybe you didn't. But writing this down feels like the only way to let it go. Or maybe let it begin, I'm not sure." The letter ended with a simple sentiment. "If you don't feel the same, it's okay. I won't bother you again. I just needed you to know." It wasn't a desperate note, nor a farewell. It was hopeful, open, and sincere, an attempt at connection after years of silence. Ella sat back in her chair, exhaling slowly. For decades, people had speculated about Ellen's state of mind, her intentions, whether she had run away or suffered some tragic fate. But this letter told a different story. Ellen had been vulnerable, yes, but far from reckless. She hadn't been planning to vanish. She was reaching out, quietly, carefully, and with a sense of hope. When the news broke that Ellen's personal letter had been found inside a tree, alongside her diary, a wave of emotion spread across the community. For those old enough to remember her, it stirred dormant memories. For others, it opened new questions. Why had she stopped in the woods that evening? Why hide the bag? And what happened afterward? The diary offered more pieces. The entries were dated sporadically, spanning the months leading up to April 1971. Ellen wrote about her sense of isolation, tension at home, and her growing anxiety over feeling like a misfit in a town that didn't understand her. She also wrote of the woods, a place where she often walked to think, to write, to breathe freely, as she put it. One entry, dated just 3 days before her disappearance, read, "Sometimes the trees feel safer than people. I know every path, every place I can sit and be invisible." Another, on the morning of her disappearance, was just a single sentence. "If he doesn't feel the same, I'll have to leave. I can't stay here if I'm still invisible." Detective Ellis read and reread that line. It wasn't a threat. It wasn't a plan to run away. It sounded more like a moment of emotional urgency, a crossroad, not an escape route. Botanists were consulted to determine the age and structure of the tree. Their findings were fascinating. The oak had likely been hollow for decades and had developed a natural cavity large enough to fit a small object like a handbag. By the mid-1970s, the tree had grown around that space, sealing it from view entirely. What intrigued them most was the placement. The bag hadn't fallen in. It had been carefully slid into the cavity from a low opening that had long since disappeared beneath the bark. No bite marks, no claw scratches, no evidence of animal activity, just human intention. But why? Ellis returned to the site with a team of forensic archaeologists. The tree stood along an overgrown footpath, just off the old deer path trail Ellen was known to walk. The ground was soft, covered in moss and decaying leaves. A few broken branches suggested the area hadn't seen heavy foot traffic in years. They began a limited excavation around the tree's base, careful not to damage its roots. Metal detectors were used, but no new items were found. Still, as they dug slightly deeper, they uncovered a low, flat stone worn smooth by time. When turned over, it revealed faint markings, barely visible carvings of initials. EP, just above them, scratched into the stone with a thin point, were the words, "For now I wait." The phrase was ambiguous. Was Ellen planning to return? Had she meant to retrieve the letter if she changed her mind? Or had she intended the tree as a hiding place, a temporary moment of silence before deciding what to do next? There was one theory gaining traction. Ellen had climbed the tree or settled beside it to collect her thoughts. In doing so, she may have fallen, injured herself, or suffered a medical event like a fainting spell or panic attack. If she had been hurt and unable to call for help, the thick woods could have hidden her from searchers, especially in an era without GPS or helicopters. But if she had died nearby, why weren't her remains ever found? That mystery still lingered. The closest match came in 1974, when a hiker reported finding an old shoe along a shallow ravine near Miller's Preserve. At the time, it wasn't linked to any known case. The shoe was discarded. Now, decades later, Ellis wondered if that hiker had unknowingly stepped near the final resting place of a girl no one had been able to find. Meanwhile, the recovered items were returned to the Prager family. Rachel, now in her 70s, received her sister's diary with quiet reverence. She ran her fingers across the worn leather cover and whispered, "She wasn't lost. She was still talking to us. We just didn't hear her until now." Daniel Harper, still living in Pennsylvania, was also informed. He remembered Ellen fondly, but was stunned by the letter. "I had no idea," he said, voice shaking. "I wish I had known. Maybe I could have said something." He was handed a copy of the letter, and he read it in silence. And then he said, "She was the kind of person who said what mattered, even if it scared her. That takes courage." The town of New Oxford began preparing a memorial to be placed near the tree. A stone bench, a plaque, and a glass frame with Ellen's final words from her diary. But as the planning began, another letter surfaced. This one hadn't been placed in a tree or sealed in a diary. It arrived by mail, addressed to the police department. No return address. Postmarked from Allentown. Inside was a torn piece of notebook paper. 3 words. Handwritten. Unmistakable. She never left. The envelope was plain and unremarkable. Standard white. No markings besides a return address field left blank. But inside, the note was anything but ordinary. 3 words, written in precise, slanted handwriting. She never left. Detective Nora Ellis held the slip of paper between 2 gloved fingers. There was no signature, no date, no explanation. Just that eerie phrase, sent more than 50 years after Ellen Prager disappeared. The envelope had been postmarked from Allentown, Pennsylvania, nearly 100 miles east of New Oxford. Ellis immediately contacted the local post office, hoping for camera footage or metadata, but the branch didn't retain surveillance that far back. The letter could have come from anywhere nearby, or from someone simply passing through. Still, the timing was too deliberate to ignore. The media had only recently reported the discovery of Ellen's bag. The story had made regional news, and her name had once again reached the public. For someone to send a message now, someone who claimed Ellen never left, suggested a connection deeper than coincidence. Ellis brought the note to her forensic handwriting analyst. After comparing it to Ellen's diary and letter, the conclusion was swift. It was not Ellen's writing. It was also not Rachel's, nor Daniel Harper's. It appeared to be male, likely written with a ballpoint pen under steady pressure. Confident strokes. Almost rehearsed. She pulled out every page of Ellen's diary again, searching for names, incidents, patterns. One entry stood out now in a different light. March 4th, 1971. Saw him again near the trail. I keep telling myself it's nothing, but it's the 3rd time. I think he works for the farm down the hill. Or maybe he's just wandering. There was no name, no details. Just him. Ellis checked land records. In 1971, the southern border of Miller's Preserve had connected to 3 private properties. One was a now-defunct dairy farm owned by a man named Everett Langston. He had passed away in 1986, but his son, Paul Langston, had lived on the land until 2004 before moving to, Ellis paused, Allentown. The name had never come up in the original investigation. She tracked Paul Langston down through property records and found a current address. Retired, 74 years old, and living alone in a modest home near a wooded park. She paid him a visit. Paul was cooperative, even polite. He invited her into the screened porch and poured 2 glasses of lemonade. His hands trembled slightly, but his voice was steady. "I heard about the discovery," he said. "The tree, the bag. I saw it on the news." When asked if he knew Ellen Prager, he hesitated, then nodded slowly. "We were in the same school district. She was older than me by a few years. I remember her walking that trail near our property. Quiet girl." Ellis asked if he had ever spoken to her. He paused. "Once or twice. Nothing important. She always seemed deep in thought." Then she asked if he had written a letter. His eyes narrowed. "No, ma'am." But there was a flicker, barely noticeable, a shadow of something behind the gaze. Ellis didn't push it. She thanked him and left, but she had the envelope analyzed for trace evidence. No usable prints, no DNA. Whoever had sent it had been careful. Still, the words lingered. She never left. Ellis returned to the tree. The site had since been turned into a partial memorial area, cordoned off with a small wooden fence and an information plaque. But the tree remained, tall and weathered, hollowed by age, scarred by what had kept hidden for half a century. She walked the perimeter, letting instinct guide her, and then, just beyond the tree's far side, she noticed something strange. A dip in the ground. Unnatural, not erosion, more like a shallow depression. A forensic team was called in. They scanned the ground and identified an anomaly roughly 2 feet beneath the surface. Excavation began. What they uncovered was a wooden box, rotted at the corners, warped by decades of soil and moisture. Inside was a tangle of cloth and rusted metal, a compact mirror, a broken shoe buckle, and a ring engraved with the initials EP. But still no remains. The soil had shifted over the years, and decomposition would have taken its toll. But this new discovery, so close to the original site, gave weight to a revised theory. Ellen may not have fallen or vanished deep into the forest. She may have remained within mere yards of the tree all along, buried, silently, deliberately, and if that was true, someone had put her there. Ellis reviewed the timing again. Ellen disappears April 12, 1971. Search parties combed the woods for weeks, but the exact spot behind the tree was never excavated. It looked undisturbed, natural. Whoever placed a handbag inside the hollow must have done it before the tree sealed. They had time, days, maybe weeks, and they had knowledge of where the body was and how to hide evidence. Was it Paul Langston, a man with access to the land, a quiet presence on the edge of town, and now living alone hundreds of miles away, or someone else entirely? Back at the station, Ellis compiled a timeline of everyone known to have lived near the preserve in 1971. One name, barely noted in the original case file, surfaced again. A farmhand, unrelated to the Langstons, who'd worked briefly on the dairy farm that spring. Hired in March. Disappeared in May. No forwarding address. No family. He went by the name Clyde. No last name. Ellis tried tracing employment records, but the farm's logs had long been destroyed. Still, something about the timing was too neat. Ellen had written about a man near the trail. That was in March. Clyde had been hired that same week, then left town shortly after Ellen vanished. No known connection. No criminal history. Just gone. Was Clyde the one Ellen saw in the woods? Was he the one who buried her and placed her belongings in the tree? And if so, was it Clyde who had sent the note in 2022? Unlikely. The man would be in his 70s now, if still alive. The letter's handwriting was firm and unshaken, more like someone younger, or someone else entirely. Ellis turned back to the note. The phrase had haunted her since the day it arrived. She never left. Not she was killed. Not she ran. Not even she's here. It was phrased like a memory, a fact, a presence. As if Ellen's story had been resting in that forest all along, waiting patiently for someone to listen. But then a new question rose. Why send the letter now? Why, after 51 years, had someone decided to speak? Ellis would get her answer 2 weeks later, when a second envelope arrived. No note this time, just a photograph of Ellen, smiling, standing beside a tree, and behind her, a figure almost out of frame, just a shadow. The photograph arrived without a word. No return address, no signature, just an old Polaroid in a manila envelope, sealed in plastic, postmarked from Baltimore, Maryland. Detective Nora Ellis opened it carefully under controlled lighting, her hand steady, breath held. The image was slightly yellow with age. It showed a clearing in the woods, dappled with sunlight filtering through the trees. Ellen Prager stood at the center of the frame, smiling faintly, one hand resting against the trunk of a familiar oak. She looked calm, eyes thoughtful, hair tucked behind one ear, the kind of moment you capture without warning. But it wasn't just Ellen. Behind her, barely visible at the edge of the frame, was a second figure. Only part of a shoulder and a sliver of a face were visible, just enough to suggest someone had been standing with her, watching, maybe even holding the camera. Ellis froze the image and scanned it digitally. The resolution was low, the shadowed figure blurred by the natural light and grain of old film. Still, it was enough to raise every hair on her arms. This photo had not been seen by investigators before. It had never been among the Prager family belongings, nor in any local archives or yearbooks. And the tree Ellen leaned against, it was the tree, the same hollow oak where her bag had been discovered 50 years later. Ellis leaned back in her chair, staring at the screen. The implications were impossible to ignore. Someone had been with her that day, and someone had kept this photograph all this time. She sent the photo to a forensics lab, requesting enhancement and facial recognition analysis on the partial figure. The lab returned their findings in 48 hours. No matches, no facial clarity. The figure was partially obstructed, with too little distinguishing data to generate an ID. But there was one surprising detail. The photo had a timestamp embedded in the emulsion layer, common in instant cameras of the early 1970s. Faint numbers were just barely visible along the white frame. April 12, 71. The very day Ellen disappeared. That changed everything. This was not a memento from a friend. This was a photograph taken just hours, maybe even minutes, before Ellen vanished, and it had been in someone's possession for over half a century. Ellis visited Rachel Prager, now living in a quiet assisted living complex in Lancaster. She laid the photo gently on the table between them. Rachel's eyes widened. Her hands flew to her mouth. "That's Ellen," she whispered. "That's her sweater. She wore it all the time that spring." Ellis pointed to the tree. "Do you recognize this spot?" Rachel looked closer. "Yes, that's near the overlook. She used to sit there and write. Said it felt like the one place nobody expected her to be anything." Then Ellis tapped the blurred figure. Rachel leaned in, her brow furrowed. "I don't know who that is." But she never said anything about meeting someone that day, just that she had a letter to deliver. For Ellis, the message was clear. Ellen hadn't just gone for a walk. She had met someone, perhaps to talk, or perhaps to share what she had written. The letter to Daniel might have been only one part of what she carried that day. And whoever took this photo had been close enough to keep it, to hide it, and now to send it. Back at the station, Ellis worked through her wall of evidence, photos, notes, timeline fragments. She laid out the sequence again. April 12, 1971. Ellen leaves home with a letter. She's last seen near the edge of the Deer Path Trail. She disappears. Her handbag is found inside a hollow tree in 2022. A note arrives. She never left. A photo follows, time-stamped to the day she vanished. There was a pattern now. Someone had been waiting, holding these fragments for decades, choosing this moment after the discovery of the bag to begin sending them. But why? Was it guilt? A need to unburden? Or was it something else? Something calculated? Ellis called in her lead analyst, asking for any trace materials from the envelope or photo. Fibers, pollen, anything. The results were minimal, but one clue emerged. Trapped between the plastic and photo edge was a single strand of dried grass. Unique in color and shape, it was identified as prairie dropseed, native to certain areas of southern Pennsylvania. A rare species, not found near New Oxford, but common around the Susquehanna River Valley. It wasn't proof, but it suggested the sender had prepared the photo in that region, maybe even stored it there for years. Ellis turned her focus south, scanning old directories and property records. She cross-referenced names from the original 1971 investigation. That's when she saw it. Clyde. No last name on record. No photo, but a first name mentioned by a now-deceased dairy farmer during an interview in 1973. The man had said a quiet drifter named Clyde had worked with him for a few months in '71 before leaving town without notice. Ellis pulled property records for the farm adjacent to Miller's Preserve and found an unexpected entry. In 1982, a small cabin on that land had been sold quietly, under a trust, to a buyer with only a first initial, C. The cabin had been used rarely since. It now stood abandoned. Ellis got a warrant and drove out with her team. The cabin, nestled behind tall reeds and brush, was barely standing. Vines twisted up the walls, the roof sagged, its porch creaked with every step. Inside, the air was musty. A rusted cot, a broken lantern, and a stack of decaying newspapers sat in the corner. But in the back room, something stopped them cold. A metal box. Inside, dozens of letters, all unopened, all addressed to different people, none matching known residents of New Oxford. Most were blank inside, but one envelope bore a familiar name, Rachel Prager. Ellis opened it carefully. Inside was a torn photograph, this one showing Ellen seated on a rock, writing in a notebook. The same sweater, the same woods. On the back, written in small, shaking letters, she said she needed time. So I waited. I'm still waiting. There were no fingerprints, no DNA, but tucked at the bottom of the box was a folded note, yellowed, thin, barely legible. Sometimes the trees talk. You just have to listen. Ellis stared at the message, the photograph, the letters. Someone had been following Ellen, watching her, and perhaps in some distorted way, believing they were protecting her, or keeping her. For 50 years. The inside of the old cabin was nearly silent, save for the occasional creak of floorboards shifting under age. Detective Nora Ellis stood alone now, the box of letters open before her, the final note. Sometimes the trees talk. You just have to listen. Resting in her gloved hand. It was the kind of sentence that chilled you not because of what it said, but because of what it implied. She flipped through the stack again. The envelopes were handmade, folded precisely, but many were blank. Most had been sealed and never sent. Some had only a name on the front. Others had no markings at all. But all of them shared a certain feel, obsession hidden behind care, secrecy disguised as gentleness. This wasn't random. This was ritual. And then she found one more letter, tucked beneath the bottom lining of the box. A single page, folded 4 times, crisp along the edges, as if preserved with a kind of reverence. It read, she wanted to stay. I tried to keep her safe. I left the tree to guard her. I thought they would understand when they were ready. It was signed only with a single initial, C. Ellis stared at the letter. The tree had become a symbol for the entire mystery, where Ellen's bag was hidden, where the trail seemed to end, where people came now to leave flowers, sit in silence, or just remember. But for whoever C was, the tree was more than a place. It was a guardian of a secret, a monument built not by hands, but by time and silence. The man who called himself Clyde, the same one who vanished from records in 1971, may have lived in the shadows just beyond reach for decades, watching, writing, never speaking, until the tree gave up its truth. Ellis had the box cataloged and sent to forensics for further analysis. Then, with a local historian's help, she cross-referenced school records, property leases, and utility bills from the early 70s. One name surfaced: Clyde Hartley, a substitute janitor who had worked part-time at New Oxford High for less than a semester. Hired in February 1971. Terminated in April. No formal complaint, no arrest. Just gone. Ellis returned to Rachel Prager once more. She placed a final photo, the one of Ellen seated on the rock, writing in her notebook. On the table, Rachel's eyes filled with tears. That was her favorite place. She used to say the wind sounded different there. Ellis nodded. There's no official confirmation, but I think someone watched her, possibly followed her. Not just that day, maybe for weeks. Someone who thought they were keeping her safe. But something happened, something they couldn't undo. Rachel's voice cracked. Do you think he? I think, Ellis said gently, he didn't mean to hurt her, but I also don't think he let her go. The idea that Ellen had never left the woods, not by force, but by someone's design, settled over them both like a low fog. As the weeks passed, the story reached farther than Ellis had expected. The discovery of the cabin, the photo, the letters, it all made national news. Some saw it as a tragic end to a mystery, others as a glimpse into the mind of a man who lived with secrets too heavy to carry openly. No remains were ever found. The forest had grown, shifted, absorbed whatever might have once marked Ellen's presence. But the truth, Ellis realized, wasn't in bones or fingerprints. It was in the silence that had finally been broken. The community center in New Oxford, which had long planned a small memorial trail near Miller's Preserve, expanded its project. They created a quiet path, ending at the base of the oak tree that had held Ellen's bag for 5 decades. A plaque was placed there in her memory. Ellen Prager, 1950 to 1971. She walked into the trees. We hear her now. At the dedication ceremony, Rachel read a passage from Ellen's diary. Her voice trembled but did not falter. Some places are big enough for your thoughts. Not everyone finds those places. But I did, and maybe that's enough. Afterward, people laid flowers, postcards, and small folded notes at the base of the tree. Children drew stars in the dirt. Strangers whispered thanks for a story that had been buried and unearthed with care. A year later, a ranger found something resting against the tree trunk. A leather-bound notebook. New, untouched. On the first page, only one line. For the next voice that needs to be heard. No one saw who left it. No one claimed it. But it stayed. As for Detective Nora Ellis, she visits the tree every April. She sits on the bench nearby, listens to the wind, and watches the branches move like whispers across the sky. She knows the case is closed in all the ways it can be. But she also knows that some stories don't end with arrests or headlines. Some end with a name remembered, a voice recovered, and a silence finally broken. And as long as the tree stands, Ellen Prager will never be lost again.